Economist from SABC, the Steel and Engineering Industries Federation of South Africa, Henk Langenhoven. Henk, so let's go back to my first question. Is this all about China flooding the world with steel? Is there too much, or is there not enough demand for steel because of slowing economies?
It's both. The world economy has slowed down. It started in America, it has spilled over to Europe, and eventually the demand in the world slowed down, and China was exporting a lot of steel. But simultaneously, there's been huge capacity installation right across the world. We're sitting with something like 2.5 billion tons capacity and only 1.6, 1.7 billion consumption of steel.
Sure.
So there's about 600 million tons. Just South Africa is 6 million, not 600 million,
sure.
Available for trade, and like many companies, if you can't sell something, you drop the price, and that's been happening all over the world.
Is this China's fault? Because people are saying China is selling steel at lower than cost. It wants to try and get rid of the steel that is no longer being used to build skyscrapers and cities overnight, and it wants to keep Chinese people in jobs.
Yeah. If you analyze the Chinese economy and you look at a term that we often use in the steel sector, is how much steel is used per person relative to your economy's growth. If you look at that graph, it's almost vertical, the consumption of China, because of the massive decades of investment that took place in all sorts of industries, of which the steel industry was one, because like you said, it's the food for the rest. It supplies right into all sorts of other, it's essential for other sectors in the economy. And they were growing in that mode. They were investment driven. That has now changed. You cannot keep on investing, because there comes a point where you have overcapacity, which is now what has happened in the steel market. And they're trying to rebalance, is the word that is being used, to go to more consumption-led growth. You can either grow at government expenditure, investment expenditure, or consumption-led growth, and they're trying to rebalance their economy in that way. And of course now the demand inside of China is actually slowed down dramatically. And there's nothing replacing it. The Indian economy is more or less doing the same type of thing, but on a much lower level. The South Americans, you see the same type of pattern, but it is chalk and cheese from what has happened. Minute, less than 10% of the sort of growth that you saw in China is happening now here and there in other parts of the world. But I mean, you know,
yeah.
The South American countries are suffering.
The picture you're creating is that if nothing is done, Chinese imports from China will flood all markets and will be much cheaper. They just have this excess steel. So what is the policy response? Because the United States is saying we're going to raise trade barriers, and this is something that South Africa is doing, maybe not at a fast enough pace. What do you think?
Yeah, look, we've been the last to do this. It's been all over the world, and the OECD has been studying this quite in depth. That is the short-term solution, because the other side of the coin is what happens if you don't have a steel industry. I mean, in our country, it's 400,000 people. Just think about it. There's an old saying.
Do we need our own steel industry? That's a good question.
Well, do we need work for 400,000 people? That's really the question. And
so you're saying, though, that is the number of jobs really at stake here.
It's 20%.
And in what time frame?
No, it's at the moment, we have about 400,000 people. It dropped from, we'd lost 45,000 in the steel industry alone from 2007. Last year, about 11,000. So it's declining, but we're depending on our mining sector to buy the steel, and the auto sector and the construction sector. And none of them have been doing that well over the last period. So, and exports, of course. We export more processed steel to the tune of about 40-50% of domestic production. But domestically, we are providing to all these different sub-industries. It's 20% of the economy. It's 1.7 million people in the economy that are employed and kept busy by this sector and its big markets in South Africa.
What would SABC want? Higher trade barriers to protect our local steel industry?
We cannot very well afford to lose the basic ferrous, which is what we're talking about, the basic from iron ore to steel products. We can't afford that. It happened in Australia, and they have terrible problems and exposed to all the instabilities. But we equally need to be very careful to raise the cost of the downstream companies that are using the steel to make other things and sometimes export it, and destroy them. So in the basic ferrous industry, about 30,000 of this 400,000 people employed. So you can just imagine, if you lose this, then the ripple effect to the others, and you can't very well use any one of them. In the short term, to answer your question in one sentence, is a little bit of protection, carefully, very nuanced. But secondly, we will have to do things differently. The Chinese, because they were growing so fast, they've been able to invest in the best and the newest technology. So a lot of their latest furnaces and plants are streets ahead of what we have. That has not happened as fast in South Africa, and for that matter in the rest of the world. There's been smelters closing down in America. And
you raise a good point, that the companies prefer cheaper steel. We're trying to attract more auto investment, things
absolutely.
like that. Is that another problem? We're not making enough things here.
That is true. It is true there are all sorts of other costs involved. I think the other important issue is to understand where we are at the moment. The sector got a delayed hit from the 2007-2008 financial crisis. And it was so serious that it's about 30% reduction in production that we saw. And we haven't really recovered from that. So that specific issue caused capacity utilization to be quite low. Now, if you have a machine that can work 24 hours and you're now only working it for 8 hours because you don't have demand for the other two sessions that you could do it, your unit cost goes up. So just because of the dynamics of the process, you become uncompetitive. So, and that's the old theory behind raising the tariff slightly, just to get that capacity utilized of what we have. And then have all sorts of positive spin-offs, because you make a little bit of money, you can actually reinvest, and you can catch up. But without filling this gap, it's very difficult to make the jump.
This is so fascinating to me. So maybe a little bit more protection here, but and in brief, please, where do you see this thing going on a global level? Because China and the US are at odds over cheap steel. This is potentially big, isn't it?
It's not new. It's at least 3 years old. It's just now that the Chinese, I saw the news clips today, that they are responding a little bit more aggressively. An interesting thing, just to give you another thing, iron ore jumped today to $60 a ton. It was 41 in December.
That's your steel input? That's
the steel input. Our guys are buying it from Kumba at the world price. And you're sitting in this very volatile situation at the moment. But the end game is you have to be better at what you're doing.
All right, I like that attitude. Thank you very much. So fascinating. Henk Langenhoven from SABC, the Steel and Engineering Industries Federation of South Africa.